This man, Robert Bush, has one of the biggest funeral scandals I've ever heard. For a grieving family, a funeral director occupies an extraordinary position of trust. People hand over the bodies of their dead loved ones to him to care for until their funeral. They provide personal belongings, photographs, clothing, and money. They expect the funeral coordinator to take care of their dead loved ones and make necessary arrangements for their funeral as professionals. If cremation is chosen, they trust that the ashes returned to them are genuinely those of their dead loved ones. It was within this environment of profound trust that Robert Bush built his career. Bush, who resides in East York, became the owner of Legacy Independence Funeral Director, which operates in Hull and the surrounding areas. The business presented itself as a family funeral service offering reassurance and professional care to people during bereavement. Behind that public image, however, prosecutors will eventually establish a very different story. Over a period of time, for more than a decade, Bush committed fraud, mishandled human remains, failed to provide funeral service that family had paid for, and took money that was supposed to be held for future funeral or passed to charity. The scale was enormous, and eventually, police discovered something that shocked even experienced investigators. Dozens of dead bodies were still inside his funeral premises when their family had been made to believe that their dead loved ones' funeral had already been completed. Bush's criminal conduct was not confined to one terrible mistake or one period of chaos. According to charges to which he ultimately pleaded guilty, his offense stretches from 2012 to 2024. One part of the scheme involved prepared funeral plans. People paid Bush money because they wanted to ensure that their funeral expenses will be dealt with in the future. Such plans are intended to protect family from having to deal with the financial burden when someone dies. According to the prosecution, Bush did not properly place the money with the appropriate financial institution. Instead, money paid by customers for funeral plan was transferred into accounts connecting to Bush. The Crown prosecution stated that the fraudulent funeral plan operation affected 226 individuals, involving a total of £560,000. Bush had provided documents that legitimate funeral arrangement existed, but in real life, the money had not been properly protected as customers had been made to believe. The deception was therefore not limited to the dead. It also affected the living family who believed they had responsibly planned for the future. The most disturbing part of the case concerned the treatment of body after people died. A funeral director is supposed to ensure that deceased person is properly cared for until their final disposition. That can mean burial or cremation depending on the family wishes. Instead, investigators discovered that Bush had sometimes kept body at his premises for extraordinarily long period. One of the most striking examples involved Norman Brigger, whose body was eventually recovered from the Legacy premises almost 1 year after his death. His daughter, Karen King, described the horror of discovering that her father's body had been effectively forgotten inside the funeral home. The situation was not simply a case of paperwork being delayed. The bodies were being physically and deliberately left inside the premises. The entire scandal began to unravel on March 6, 2024, when Homicide Police received information raising concern about the care of deceased people at Legacy Independence Funeral Directors. The discovery happened while Bush was on vacation in the United States. According to evidence later given in court, Bush had asked two funeral directors from another funeral company to help him cover a funeral service on his behalf at his premises while he was away in the United States. Bush was so unbothered about how he handled deceased people, he even went on a vacation in America. But unfortunately for him, that vacation happened to be the beginning of his nightmare. Because it was that vacation that made him invite another funeral directors from another company to come and help him cover a funeral service on his behalf so he can enjoy his vacation in America. When those funeral directors he invited arrived at his premises, they became suspicious. When they discovered numerous bodies scattered all over the premises in an unprofessional manner, some were even at a decomposing stage, the situation was so disturbing that they had to inform the police. The investigation that followed will become one of the most disturbing funeral home care in modern British history. The situation was so horrific that when police searched the Legacy premises, They found 35 bodies, and many were in various stages of decomposition. The bodies had not been properly cared for, and investigators found evidence that the body had been left unattended for a long period of time. The condition was described as a full-blown horror how Bush mishandled deceased people under his care. The condition was described in court as deeply undignified. Some bodies were lying on rack, others were lying on floor. There were bodily fluid on some decomposed body. The investigator also discovered the inadequate identification procedure. This also created another terrible problem because even after police recovered remains, they had to determine who the deceased actually were, and whether the ashes already given to families were genuine. The most heartbreaking discovery about this whole scenario was the remains of a stillborn baby. The baby's name was Sonny Beverly Collins. Sonny had been miscarried at approximately 18 weeks in May 2022. His parents trusted Bush to arrange his cremation. But sadly, Robert Bush, in his usual manner, didn't cremate the baby. But the family already believed that the funeral process of the baby had been completed. It was a terrible shock to everyone when police discovered the remains of the baby inside brown paper bag at Legacy premises. The police had no idea it was the remains of a little baby. They initially thought it was a bed inside the brown bag until they noticed the hospital identification band on the baby. That single discovery traumatized Sonny's mother, Jasmine Beverly. She expressed a terrible betrayal for trusting Bush with her child for cremation and giving her a wrong ashes that didn't belong to her child, probably for something else or someone else's ashes. But sadly, it was hard to determine if the ashes given to her was genuine. So she received it as at the time without any suspicion. For the family, the tragedy was so compounding. They had not only lost their child, they had also been deprived of the certainty that the final welfare they thought they had held was actually for him, not knowing that it wasn't. The discovery of bodies was only one part of the nightmare. Police also found more than 10 sets of ashes at Legacy's premises. Some were labeled and some were not. Some families had already received ashes they thought it belonged to their relative, but at this point it is hard to determine if truly it was theirs or not, because the cremation process destroyed DNA due to the hot temperature involved. So the police cannot determine people's DNA from the cremation material. This left family facing an agonizing question: if those ashes they received were truly that of their dead loved ones or not. In many cases, there is no way of giving them a definitive answer. Police had established that 46 families had received wrong ashes in one group of cases, while others 11 families had never received ashes at all. The consequences were so profound that some families had scattered the ashes, others placed them in jewelries. One family intended to incorporate the ashes into a tattoo. Now the police investigation revealed that the ashes might not truly belong to their relative as they believe. Those acts of remembrance could not simply be undone. One of the key elements of the prosecution was that Bush represented to families that their relative had been cremated when they had not. He even went as far as giving them fake ashes while their relative are still laying in his mortuary. So far, Bush had deceived 31 families about cremating their dead relative when he didn't. The Crown Prosecution Service said this offense represents an exceptional serious breach of trust within the funeral industry. As investigators walked through the premises, the scale of disorder became so apparent. There were ashes and containers scattered all around the premises. Personal possessions belonging to deceased people were found all over the building. Clothes that relatives provide for their loved ones had accumulated without being properly used. Photographs intended to be placed with bodies in coffins were also recovered. The mortuary premises had become a place where the remains and possession of deceased people were left in an unacceptable condition. The prosecutor argued that this was not an isolated administrative failure but a sustainable pattern of misconduct. Another painful discovery concerns Allen Chairman. His family actually collected ashes that they believed were his and wanted to scatter them on an emotional significant date. Mr. Bush's conduct also extended to charitable donation. At funeral, families and mourners sometimes collected money for charity in memories for the deceased. Those donations might be intended for organizations such as Salvation Army or Macmillan Cancer Support. According to the prosecution, money collected for charity was passed to Bush to forward to the intended organization, but he didn't do so. He ultimately pleaded guilty to theft relating to donations from 12 charity organizations. That means even charity acts performed in memories of dead relatives were also exploited. The prosecutor said that Bush used money obtained through his business to fund his lifestyle. Because Bush was already on a vacation in America when the event that ultimately exposed the condition of his funeral premises unfolded. By the time he returned to British, he was arrested at Heathrow Airport on the 10th of March 2024. Homicide police described the investigation as exceptionally complex because more than 13,000 exhibits were eventually submitted to prosecutors. Prosecutors had to establish whose the body were, how long they had remained at Legacy's mortuary, whether families had been told the truth, or which ashes has been given to families, and whether ashes actually belong to the deceased, how funeral plan money had been handled, and what happened to charitable donation. The investigation therefore went far beyond simply recovering improper stored body. It became an examination of Bush's entire funeral operation. Robert Bush was eventually charged with dozens of offenses. The case ultimately involved 67 charges that include 30 counts of preventing the lawful and decent burial of a baby, numerous counts of fraud by false representation, fraud involving cremated remains, fraudulent trading concerning funeral plans. Most importantly, in British law, the relevant offense concerning burial can encompass the final lawful disposition of a deceased person, including cremation. So, many victims had chosen cremation rather than traditional burial. Bush could still be prosecuted for preventing a lawful and decent final disposition of deceased person. The legal process did not begin with Bush admitting everything. In October 2025, he pleaded guilty to a substantial number of offenses, but initially pleaded not guilty to the 30 charge concerning him preventing lawful and decent burial. A trial was originally scheduled for 2026, but before that trial took place, Bush changed his position. On 2nd April 2026, he pleaded guilty to the remaining 31 charges, that brought to a total of 67 charges. The sentencing hearing at Crown Court became an extraordinary catalogue of brief. More than 200 victims and affected families were involved in the wider case, and more than 80 victims presented their statement to the court during the sentencing process. Mr. Justice Nicholas Hillard was ultimately responsible for the sentences of Robert Bush. The judge included that Bush's culpability was extremely high. The reason was not simply the number of offenses, it was the relationship between Bush and his victim. The family came to him at one of the most vulnerable moments of their lives. They entrusted him with the bodies of their dead loved ones. They believed he could carry out the final duties surrounding those deaths with dignity. Instead, the court found out that he had exploited those trusts in a massive scale. Finally, on 31st July 2026, Robert Bush was finally sentenced at Hull Crown Court to 20 years in prison. The sentence followed his guilty plea to all 67 charges. It is important to understand that Bush was not sentenced to 20 years in prison simply because bodies were improperly handled. The sentence reflects the combined seriousness of his criminal conduct. He had prevent lawful and decent final arrangement for deceased people, deceived grieving families, supplied wrong ashes, left bodies at a premises for a long period of time, defraud people through funeral arrangements, misused funeral funds, and stole charitable donation. The judge also considered the numerous number of people affected. This was not just one victim, it was a succession of families who trusted the same funeral director for many years. A funeral is supposed to provide closure to families, but Bush's action destroyed that possibility. The case also raised questions far beyond Robert Bush himself. The United Kingdom has historically had limited statutory regulation of funeral directors compared to other sectors. Following the Robert Bush case, the government announced plans to strengthen regulation of funeral industry, including proposals concerning licensing, minimum standard, and inspection. The scandal therefore became a national argument whether families should entrust entirely on professional ethics when entrusting a funeral director with the remains of their dead loved ones. The 20 years cannot restore what was lost, neither can it undo the damages Bush has created in the lives of the family members. or the sad memories he has built in their heart due to the breach of trust in the funeral industry. Do you think that 20 years is enough punishment for Robert Bush, or do you think he deserves more than 20 years imprisonment? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you.